Why are Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump both called populists? Superficially, it is because both rail against corrupt elites, as well as inspire a passionate following composed of ordinary people. Yet this is hardly a satisfactory basis for a shared classification. Bernie Sanders is basically a New Deal-style Democrat who advocates the kinds of social democratic policies that have been successfully implemented in wealthy countries around the world. Donald Trump, on the other hand, appeals to fear of immigrants, of refugees, of crime, of economic and social decline. To understand why Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump are grouped together, we have to understand the movement which birthed the term, populism. The Populists were farmers and workers who in the late 19th century challenged monopolistic capitalism. Capitalists, however, responded with a critique that characterized mass movements, reform politics, and challenges to the status quo as coming from crazy, utopian sore losers who refused to adapt to the realities and ineluctable forces of the modern economy. In this battle, capitalists naturalized their own class positions not as self-interest, but as simply a matter of universal, objective natural law. They claimed that populist policies would create runaway inflation, poverty, social regression, and government paternalism. Thus, the critique that emerges out of the war against populism, one that commentators still promote, is that those who champion policies specifically to benefit workers, or the poor, are demagogues, pandering to irrational mob rule. Capitalists also exploited gender, race, and notions of progress and backwardness to attack populists. First, who were the populists? Mainly, they were farmers in the West and South, places where agriculture boomed after the Civil War. But these were not little family farms. What emerged was vast belts of land devoted to single crops. Corn in Illinois and Iowa, wheat in the Great Plains, dairy in Wisconsin and Minnesota. And in the South, poor whites and blacks became cotton tenants. Tenancy expands because the privatization of public lands forced many subsistence farmers into market production. But you can't just start growing any crop. You need tools and seed, which costs money. Since bankers saw the South as a good region for cotton, they generally loaned money only for cotton production. In the West, starting a farm was expensive. A farmer would have to build a house, maybe a barn, buy tools and seeds, and still need money to live until the harvest. So Western farmers also borrowed money, and to pay off debt they maximized the number of crops they could sell on the market, which precluded diversified farms. And a farmer can grow a lot of corn or wheat with little labor. By the 1880s, mortgage debt accounted for about half of Western farm value. Railroads made possible the expansion of westward farming, but railroads were controlled by capitalists, who abused their market power to prevent competition. One example we could find is in California, which was dominated by the Southern Pacific Railroad in the late 19th century. Their monopoly was threatened by the Pacific Mail Company, which could ship goods from California to New York cheaper than they could be transported over land by railroad. So the Southern Pacific Railroad paid the Pacific Mail Company to charge higher rates. There are other ways the Southern Pacific Railroad discouraged competing modes of transport. Some farmers could move goods to San Francisco through rivers such as the San Joaquin. To discourage use of the San Joaquin River, the Southern Pacific charged very high prices to move goods to the river, but then made it very cheap to transport goods on the railroad near the river to San Francisco Bay. Since you've already had to pay out the wazoo to get your goods to the railway depot, you might as well continue using the railway because now it is cheap. So through exploiting their market power, railroads could limit competition and gouge farmers. Debt also disadvantaged farmers. Supply and demand tells us that when prices rise, so does supply. And when prices fall, supply does too. But when you have lots of debt, falling prices compels you to produce more to make up for declining per unit revenue. And if all the indebted farmers do this at once, they glut the market, driving prices further down, provoking even more production. So why didn't farmers just produce something else? Because they only had the tools to produce one kind of crop. And they could not get a loan for a different set of tools and seed until they paid off their previous debt. In the long term, farmers would go bankrupt and supply would fall. But in the short term, debt distorts the laws of supply and demand and leads to overproduction. Interest rates tended to be high because money was scarce. Even when commodities didn't glut the market, the amount of money that could be paid for crops was small, since the U.S. currency depended on gold. Big influxes of gold, such as during the California gold rush, could rapidly increase circulation. But otherwise, the money supply grew slower than the economy, causing prices to fall. Lower prices is good though, right? Not if you're a producer with debt. Let's say you have a $1,000 a month mortgage, $4,000 a month in non-debt expenses, with an income of $5,000. That means, roughly speaking, your expenses are equal to your income. Now, if prices fall in half, Your non-mortgage expenses will fall from $4,000 to $2,000, but your income will also fall from $5,000 to $2,500. However, your mortgage will stay at $1,000, which means now your total expenses will be more than what you make. This happens because even though prices fall generally, debt does not. Bankers love deflation because it meant repaid loans were worth more than the original debt. Let's say televisions cost $100, and I lend you money to buy one. If the prices of TVs fall in half, you repay me money that is worth 2 TVs, or twice as much as the money I lent. Farmers attributed their disadvantages to monopoly, which they defined as the ability for a small group of economic elites, or plutocrats, to determine winners and losers. In addition to the earlier example of railroads undermining alternative modes of transport, railroad capitalists extorted money from cities and counties. They could say to a city that unless it subsidized them or exempted them from property taxes, they would build elsewhere, and commerce would leave. This is similar to how today Amazon can compel cities to give them subsidies and tax breaks. So railroads could determine which cities prospered and which did not, and farmers came to believe that nobody should wield that kind of power. Furthermore, with their concentrated wealth, monopolists could buy up and corrupt legislatures. So it wasn't just the market that monopolists were distorting, it was democracy itself. Farmers began to challenge monopoly in the 1880s with the formation of farmers' alliances. The idea behind these alliances was that plutocratic power came from concentrated wealth and cooperation among the rich. So if farmers pooled their resources, they could create countervailing power. They could form their own banks and their own marketing associations to handle packaging and transporting and selling goods to distant markets. These farmers' alliances spread throughout the West and South, and at their peak, millions joined. In 1891, these alliances formed the People's Party, also known as the Populist Party. Their platform had many points, but I'll just focus on a few. For the problem of deflation, they proposed a bimetallic currency of both silver and gold to increase the money supply. To address the market distortions created by natural monopolies such as the railroads, they proposed nationalization, because any industry powerful and central enough to choose winners and losers should be democratically controlled to give everyone equal and fair access. To the problem of political corruption, they proposed more direct forms of democracy. In their thinking, a legislature of a few dozen or a few hundred people can be bought, but an entire population cannot. So they wanted direct election of senators, the recall, the referendum, and the initiative. It's worth asking, is this socialism? No. Populists did not want to abolish private property, profits, the market, or personal fortunes. What they wanted was an economy where everybody had a fair shot at succeeding in the marketplace, and they wanted to make sure that no one could choose winners and losers. There were unsavory elements of populism. The populists could be racist, although not unusually so. They subscribed to the same pseudoscientific theories of racial hierarchy that pretty much everyone else did. There were elements within the populist movement that were conspiratorial, that accused financiers of pulling the strings of the global economy, and some populists were anti-Semitic, who, similar to some people today, accused Jews of secretly running things in the background. But Americans in general were racist, and the wealthy were just as conspiratorial. So much so that they militarized police forces and built up massive urban armories in order to combat an exaggerated anarchist and socialistic threat to civilization. Later commentators and historians characterized the populists as backwards, as resistant to change, as the antithesis of modernity. Indeed, this is how the press depicted populism, as evident in this picture, which implies that both populists and Native Americans were backwards people making one last stand against modernity. The title of this picture is an allusion to the ghost dance, a religion that spread throughout the American West in the 1880s, but was eventually suppressed in the Wounded Knee Massacre, a massacre that to later historians marked the endpoint of the Indian Wars. As Louis Warren shows in his award-winning study, God's Red Sun, The Ghost Dance in the Making of Modern Religion, the ghost dance was an adaptation to the economic hardships imposed on Native Americans, whose children had often been taken away and sent to boarding schools to learn English and Christianity, and who lived in crushing poverty on barren reservations. This crushing poverty compelled many of them to join the wage labor regime that had engulfed tens of millions of people around the world. The late 19th century was a hard time to live in general for a lot of people. To cope and to find meaning in all the hardship, many folk in the United States turned to Pentecostal and prophetic religions, and so did many Native Americans in the western half of the U.S. through the ghost dance. The ghost dance originated out of a prophecy from a Native American ranch worker named Wovoka, or as he was known to white employers, Jack Wilson. Wovoka told Native Americans to abstain from alcohol and from fighting with each other. He commanded natives to love each other, to work hard and never complain, and to every so often come together and do this dance, where men, women, and children would link hands in a circle and move round and round until they received ecstatic visions. And through the ghost dance, Christ would return, restore the land to Native Americans, and raise up those who had already died. Wovoka, in short, was pointing to a way for Indians to be Indians while still engaging in wage work and market production. The agents who oversaw reservations, as well as the press, perceived only Indians failing to assimilate. They particularly balked at how women danced with men. For many of these staid Protestants, these ecstatic, exuberant, wild dances evidenced persistent savagery. On December 29, 1890, the U.S. Army massacred 300 Lakota Indians at the Lakota Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota, most of them women and children. This was the last great massacre of indigenous persons in the U.S., and it was not done because they had failed to assimilate to modernity or civilization. After all, the ghost dance wasn't any more wild or exuberant than the behavior that went on in Pentecostal churches. It happens because to most white Americans, anything an Indian did was ipso facto savage, and therefore poverty, death, and massacres was their own fault. Thus, the discourse of modernity essentializes the behavior of marginalized peoples as primitive, and it says that opposition to any policies which favor corporations or bankers is simply backwardness interfering with progress. Just as the wrongs inflicted on Native Americans was rationalized under this discourse, so were the inequalities and inequities of the capitalist economy. As scholars in recent years have come to understand, however, the populists were very much modern, just as the ghost dancers were. They believed they could improve their lives and farms through science and education. They adopted modern forms of organization. They embraced upward mobility and improvement. They advocated for systematic solutions to their problems. And they called for reforms that would make the government function more like a managerial bureaucracy rather than as a system of personal favors for the rich, or patronage. In the 1890s, the Populists won hundreds of seats in state legislatures, a few state governorships, and some seats in the Senate and Congress. But there are limits to what a third party can achieve in U.S. electoral politics. So they began to consider fusion, that is, supporting candidates from the major parties who might be sympathetic to some of their causes. They found their man in Democratic Nebraska Congressman William Jennings Bryan. Bryan was the son of a Jacksonian Democrat, and he was an evangelical Christian known for his eloquent, fiery, sermon-like oratory. His moment came at the 1896 Democratic Convention, where the Democratic Party had been split between several presidential candidates. In a rousing speech, Bryan declared that you shall not crucify mankind on a cross of gold. The convention went wild, and Bryan won the nomination on a platform of bimetallism. Bryan's opponent in the 1896 election, William McKinley, was backed by one of the richest men in America during the late 19th century, Mark Hanna. With Hanna working for McKinley, or perhaps the other way around, McKinley launched the first modern election campaign in U.S. history. Hanna raised massive amounts of money from corporations, financiers, and from wealthy Americans by scheduling the percentage to be paid depending on the kind of business. As a share of the economy, the 1896 Republican campaign is still the most expensive campaign in American history. Wealthy Americans rallied so fervently behind McKinley because they viewed Bryan as the ultimate threat, a candidate of the people who supported policies aimed directly at benefiting workers, debtors, and small farmers. He was a new kind of Democrat, unlike the bourbon Democrats such as Grover Cleveland who backed the gold standard and free markets. But it wasn't just the spending and campaigning that made this a modern election. It was a modern election in tactics as well. Republicans accused Bryan of pandering to the socialistic and anarchic elements in American society. They pointed to unrest and to labor strikes to claim that under Bryan, chaos would spiral out of control. A vote for McKinley, however, was a vote for law and order. They also claimed that silver was a standard of uncivilized nations. After all, both Mexico and China used silver currencies, whereas gold denoted modern, progressing countries and represented stability, responsibility, self-control, and prudence. In short, McKinley pandered to xenophobic prejudices and to feelings of American exceptionalism. But he was also making the point that poverty came not from systematic factors like the currency system, but from personal failings such as lack of prudence and responsibility. You can't, however, win an election just on the votes of the wealthy. So how does McKinley win over workers? Part of it is that a lot of farmers' demands seemingly conflicted with labor concerns. Farmers wanted more inflation to get more money for their crops, but inflation would eat away at worker wages. Farmers disliked tariffs because they increased the price of manufactured goods, but many workers believed that tariffs protected their jobs. Farmers correctly pointed out that tariffs were much higher than they needed to be to protect worker jobs, and that breaking up monopolistic power would enable workers to command higher wages. But ultimately, McKinley's massive propaganda campaign prevailed. He convinced workers that Republicans would keep prices in check with the gold standard and protect jobs with the tariff. McKinley also appealed to masculinity by asserting that populist plans to expand government power would create a kind of paternalism where the government took care of you as if you were a child, thereby depriving you of manly independence. McKinley won the popular vote with about 51% of the electorate, compared to Bryant's 47%. Bryant fared well in the South and the West, whereas McKinley took most of the industrialized parts of the country, the Northeast, the Midwest, and the West Coast. After 1896, new gold deposits were discovered in Alaska. So, by dumb luck, Democrats got what they wanted. Large gold influxes ended the deflationary depression of the 1890s, and McKinley got the credit. So in the 1896 election, Republicans shored up their national power by positioning themselves as the party of responsibility, masculine self-control, and law and order, the party that would stave off anarchism and socialism, inflation and hysterical, emotional, insane politics. But the Populists didn't just threaten the Republican Party. They also threatened the Southern planter elite and the Southern Democratic Party. As you can see in this visual, lynching spiked during the 1890s. This spike was precipitated by two trends. First, more African American property owners. At the end of the Civil War, perhaps 3% of African Americans owned their own farms. By 1890, that number was about 25%. Second, women were entering the workforce. The South remained mostly agrarian, but there were low-skilled, low-paid manufacturing jobs that provided women with an income and to an extent limited forms of independence. Both of these trends undermined white patriarchy. You can't have African Americans owning their own land because then they don't have to be as subservient and obedient to white men. You can't have women working because that means they don't have to be as dependent on their husbands. Though populists were racists, there were colored farmers' alliances, and Southern Democratic politicians could point to these alliances and say they were proof of growing miscegenation, or race mixing. And when a black man was lynched, in the vast majority of cases it was based on accusations of improper relations with a white woman. That could be an accusation of rape, but it could be something as seemingly innocuous as, he looked at her in a funny way. So lynching became a way for white Southern men to reassert their power over African Americans and women. And when the frequency of lynchings waned, construction of monuments to the Confederacy accelerated. The 1890s also witnessed the birth of Jim Crow, the legal regime of separation that blacks and whites must use different water fountains, different bathrooms, different schools, etc. It is a regime that inscribed into law the existing custom prescribing race mixing. Jim Crow, lynchings, and Confederate monuments united Southern white men, allowing Democrats and the white planter elite to retain control. But populism was not without its successes. Because of populism, the Democratic Party began its shift to becoming the party of poor and ordinary Americans. And agrarians captured the Democratic Party. We see this in the selection of William Jennings Bryan as the Democratic Party nominee in 1900 and again in 1908. Even in 1912, Woodrow Wilson felt compelled to appoint Bryan to be his Secretary of State. And in the early 20th century, the policies of the Democratic Party and many of their major reforms represented the demands of the agrarian wing. In 1913, the 16th and 17th Amendments were ratified. The 16th Amendment creates a national income tax, and the 17th Amendment establishes direct election of senators. The Clayton Antitrust Act of 1913 created the Federal Trade Commission, which had powers to enforce antitrust laws and prosecute corporations that attempted to restrain trade. And the threat that populists represented, along with the labor unrest in the 1890s, pushed both Democratic and Republican politicians to support checking corporate power during the Progressive Era. They also revealed certain aspects of American politics that are still true today, such as how capitalists constitute a conscious class who will exploit gender and racial anxieties to derail reform. But ultimately, the populists show how mass organizing, even when not immediately successful, can transform the terms of our political debates. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please like, comment, and subscribe. It really mean a lot.